Okay, so chapter 13, as I mentioned, on the way to the light. And I believe, Sarayda, are you going to read for us? Or who's going to read?
I don't think Soraya is there. I think Philip.
Yeah, I didn't hear her before, that's why.
Okay.
Philip?
Yes.
Yeah, could you read it for us, please?
Sure. The Roman
Just
Empire.
been drafted.
Sorry? Yeah, well.
Have just been drafted.
You either go voluntary or you're drafted. Who knows? The Roman Empire and its aberrations. As we continue to list Rome's conquests before the Lord's coming for the first flowering of Christianity, we must mention the effort put forth by the spirit entities alongside the organizing and preserving authorities of the Republic to guide the overall activity toward a grand movement of fraternity and unity of all the peoples of the planet. Today's thinkers who dream about the creation of the United States of the world, devoid of the hate-filled actions of fratricidal wars, can delve into the plans of the invisible realm during the time in Rome's history. Greece had probed all the transcendent issues of life as far as possible. In its expiatory struggle, it transferred its experiences and knowledge to the Roman family, which at the time was capable of carrying out the great endeavors of the state. With the help of education and love, the Roman family could unify the banners of the orb, thereby creating a new route for the collective evolution and laying down parallel lines for the physical and moral progress of
You can see, Philip? We lost you.
I'm lost in terms of where I'm on the page.
Top, humankind. Every effort was made toward the end. Every effort was made toward that end by the emissaries of the invisible realm, and the proof of that grand plan of unifying endeavor is that the Roman Empire was one of the finest in terms of education for the organization of modern nations. The democratic instinct of England and France, as well as their lofty endeavors at socialization, continue to represent the fruit of the education mission of the Roman Empire. The pathway of the Romans was sown with seeds and light for the future. The reality, however, is that even though Christ's messengers were able to implement many benevolent plans within that community at the time, they could not interfere with the individual freedom of the majority of its members.
Thank you to you both. So just before we start this chapter, a little word of caution. We just finished a chapter, well, just is last month. We finished chapter 12, which was the advent of Christ, of Jesus, actually. And now, in principle, you would think that this chapter is during the time of Christ and after. But this is the point that I want to make just before we start. That we are going to be moving back and forth around the time of Christ. So there will be parts of this chapter that are related to about 200 years before Christ, and parts of this chapter which are going to be dealing with a timeline that is almost 150 years after Christ's appearance, after Jesus' appearance. So just to let you know, so we don't get lost in before the Common Era or before Christ and the Common Era or after Christ. That's all. And here we are going to study not the foundation of the Roman Empire, which we saw in chapter 11, but actually its development and eventually, to some extent, its derrocade or its fall. So Roman aberrations, when we start talking about this part in chapter 13, Emmanuel is trying to point out to us that because of the sheer size of the Roman Empire, which it was so large. It had so many provinces, so many vassals, so many provinces, so many territories, that it was said that the sun rose and set in the Roman Empire. Just to give you an idea, because it expanded from all the way from the southern part of the today's United Kingdom, all the way into territories close to India, northern Africa, the entire Mediterranean. This was all part of the Roman Empire. So when it makes allusions here to a United States of the world, it's in the sense that there were so many different peoples. There were so many different populations, costumes, folklore, all under the same umbrella, the Roman umbrella, that they were in a very good place. The Roman Empire was in a very good place, historically speaking, for uniting and creating a single object or governmental object or rule, if you prefer. Unfortunately, with all of that, physically speaking, and from the spiritual side, all the assistance that was being given to those first Etruscans that Etrurians that founded the empire and took it to such a found Rome and then took it to the position of an empire. All of that assistance ended up being discarded or not used properly. And this is what we are going to be seeing in this particular chapter. All that was put in terms of efforts from the spiritual realm, and all that Rome had already here in the physical realm in terms of assets, the conquered territories and all the peoples united under their ruling, all of that ended up being for very little, because in the end, the empire fell, and fell from within because of corruption, because of aberrations in the behavior of the governmental body. It's important that we just remember quickly, Rome did not start it as an empire. Rome started as a single city in the valley of the Po River. We're talking about Italy, and that Rome eventually rose to the position of a republic, and it remained as a republic until about just half a century before the advent of Jesus. So we talk about 50 before the Common Era, and then about that time we have two triumvirates, which were governments put together and ruled and ruled by three individuals, and we're going to see them in a little bit. The famous one is the one that has Julius Caesar, and who was assassinated, as many of them were, by the way. His assassination is just famous, or let's say more famous than everybody else. But we'll see that the history of the Rome Republic, and later, even worse, the Rome Empire, is filled with assassinations. It was very rare that someone would either die of old age during when in office, or that they would simply step out and give the place to somebody else, which was usually not the case then. Either you died in office or you were basically removed by one means or another. So we have Rome, then we have the Rome Republic, then we have the Rome Triumvirates. The first triumvirate was a very informal gathering of three generals, and the second triumvirate was actually a formally established form of government. And after the second triumvirate, we start what is truly the Roman Empire, where the head of state is called an emperor, has a crown, has a mantle, has a scepter, everything, with all the regalia that accompanies that. And it was as a Roman Empire that that particular type of civilization government eventually went to ruin. When we speak here of the Roman Empire and in the chapter, we actually not looking just at the empire per se, but we are looking at the entire history of Rome, but particularly the last part. So we have to be careful with the word empire. It's done. This is not a translation issue. It's the way it is. The word empire can be used to describe, to describe a particular type of government where you have an emperor, or it can also be used as a form of expansionism. So when a country or a particular government expands its provinces or expands its territories, expands its limits, and include lots of people and influence the ways of life of other communities. As we say, for instance, today, the American imperialism, there is no such a thing as an empire in this country, but we speak of an empire in the sense of the influence that American culture has on other countries. So we have to be very careful with this word. So every now and again, if there is any confusion, please let me know. I will try to be clearer or be more precise with my words. Right? So we see here at the very end of the second paragraph on this page that the Roman Empire received from Greece quite a lot of gifts. The gift of philosophy, for instance, came from Greece. But there was a problem because, every civilization has its own peculiar mark or characteristic, if you will. And the Greeks were very philosophical. The Greeks were very studious, and they were concerned a lot with the whys. And the Romans were very pragmatic individuals. The Romans actually, if you had to find two other civilizations, for instance, that would somehow mimic their behavior, you would think of the Persian, the previous Persian Empire, and the Egyptian kingdoms, because they were also pragmatic societies, very pragmatic societies. So although the Romans inherited a lot from Greece in terms of poetry, in terms of the cultivation of the arts, and they did use them, they were not savages. We have a tendency to think of Romans just as savages, conquerors. It's not like that. They also had the idea of the cultivation of the arts and so on and so forth. But on a daily basis, they were down to earth. They wanted to be pragmatic. They wanted to get results. And this is one of the reasons why they were so successful in annexing so many territories and annexing so many different communities and peoples in their time. So Rome had this inheritance from Greece, but instead of placing that inheritance into pragmatic ways, instead of taking that inheritance that was very philosophical, right? Instead of taking that and applying on their daily lives, it became somewhat relegated as to a secondary point in their lives, almost something running in parallel to everything that they were doing. So this led to some of the aberrations that we see at the very end of the Republic. And we're going to look at a little bit of it in the next block. But some of these aberrations came exactly from their lack of democratic principles. And they already had that notion, a notion that was later on revived by the countries of England and France. When we truly mean England and France here, not United Kingdom, because this is even before there was a United Kingdom. And we see, particularly in these two countries, one, a lot more Latinized, France, a lot more Latinized than England, for instance, that also has some influence from the Germanic civilizations, not Germans, by the way, Germanic. And we see that this ends up creating, for instance, our modern concept of law. of legal rights and so on and so forth. And to date, one of the greatest contributions that we can say that we have from the Roman Empire is exactly the legal system, which was and continues to be one of the most superb achievements of humankind in general. We should not be cynical and start mentioning all the ways that it fails, because it doesn't fail because of the system. It fails because we, much like the Romans, are also corrupt. We also suffer from aberrations. We also promote these aberrations. So perhaps studying this chapter is not so much for us to get a historical perspective, but perhaps Emmanuel would like to call our attention to so much in our behavior that is deviating from the universal love, from the truth, from the solidarity, because if there is one thing that all empires, and here I use it in the general term, if all empires have in common is that all empires fall from within. All of them. You may say, oh, but such and such a territory was conquered, or this and that lost a governor. It does not matter. It is already, it's already failing their population and going to ruins way before that. What we see historically is just the event that is the famous straw that breaks the camel's back. But in the end, all empires fall from within. So if we can think of ourselves as being an empire, again, the general term, if we are an empire in ourselves, if you think about all our reincarnation processes, perhaps we should be very careful that we are not falling, that we're not going to ruins from within. In other words, by our aberrations, by our own corruption, by our own lack of attention to our moral side in particular. So this is the part that I have to comment for this first block. If there are any questions, please address them now. Okay, all right, so Philip, could you read for us abuses of authority and power?
Abuses of authority and power. Abuses of authority and power soon intoxicated the valorous city. The entire seat of government seemed like it had been overrun by an avalanche of evil forces from the lowest spheres of the invisible planes. The Roman family, whose spiritual splendor has come down through the ages to illuminate the families of today, seemed tormented by the most tenuous hidden enemies who undermined its solidest foundations little by little, immersing it in corruption and self-extermination due to the absences of watchfulness by its most advanced sentinels. A dense fog obscured all consciences, and that joyful and honest society, rich with ennobling sentiments, became a field of humiliating crimes, lugubrious tragedies, and despicable murders. The wealthy class used their excessive power to mount the chariot of oppression, which left a smoking trail of rebelliousness and blood in its wake. The Gracchi sons of the venerable Cornelia were about the last vestiges of an era characterized by a strong but equitable administration filled with honesty, wisdom, and justice.
Thank you. So it seems to be a common, it seems to be of a great agreement among historians that Rome as the collection, not just the city, but Rome being the seat of government is used to represent the entire government, the entire empire, general term again. And it seems to be of a great agreement among historians that the Republic, especially at towards the end of the Republic, were the last was the last or was the pinnacle of development in the Roman history, especially when we talk of the Gracchi. Those were two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, but in English we usually put the last name in plural, so it becomes Gracchi, but it's Gracchus for each one, Tiberius and Gaius. And these were two brothers that implemented a great many deal of reforms. One of, especially Tiberius, tried to start an agrarian reform that was later basically reversed. And but this is the last point in the Roman history where you seem to have some form of care from the government towards its provinces and territories and the peoples under their jurisdiction. After that, what we are going to see is about 500 years until the very end of the empire in 473. Actually, then it's the fall of the Roman Empire, of the Western Roman Empire, because by that time the Roman Empire ended up being divided into two parts. The Western Roman Empire fell in 1473, and the Eastern one, whose capital was Constantinople, fell 1,000 years later, 1473. But we see, especially now in this part that we're studying here, after the Gracchi the Gracchi or the Gracchus family, what we see is about 500 years of the goriest assassinations. We are talking about sons assassinating fathers, or nephews assassinating their uncles, or mothers plotting against their sons. Or it's very, very disturbing to see. But it's important that we study these things, have at least not the details of the assassinations per se. We're not talking about distilling blood here, but the idea of how much our behavior can go awry, so that we should keep ourselves as watchful sentinels and not allow ourselves to be in such a position, because it is happening today as well. Of course, today it's a lot more difficult for us to excuse me, a lot more difficult for us to end up in a situation like this, but and without any punitive measures, or without any with incarceration or something like that. In those days, and this is what it says here, that the upper classes, or I should even say the upper class, because there was no such a thing as classes. You basically, either you were a patrician or you were a plebeian, and if you were from the upper class, you could pretty much get away with anything at this point, because even their sense of justice had been so corrupted. There was so much selling of favors to one side and the other, that pretty much everybody had their hands dirty. So you would just call in favors, and that would be about it. There would be no judgment, there would be no justice dispensed. So they literally, many of them, the vast majority of them, got away with murder, literally and figuratively speaking. And Emmanuel says here something very poetically when he mentions the immersing Rome in corruption and self-extermination due to the absence of watchfulness by its most advanced sentinels. What does that translate to? Simply that the government was corrupt, that the government started in such a way that there was no way, if the powers that be could not control and organize themselves, why would they expect anything else from the territories, from the other peoples? So we see from this point on that it becomes more and more difficult to manage the empire, not necessarily because of its size. Of course, the length and breadth of the empire, it was very large, and it did make it difficult to control everything. But what we see here is that there were so many favors being sold left and right. There was so much corruption already in the machinery that's supposed to control it, that eventually it got out of hand completely. So the whole idea of the advanced sentinels here, these were the enlightened individuals in government, because these are the individuals who have some form of education or another. We have to remember that there is no education in those days. There are no schools. You're not talking about a society that is literate as our society is today, or half literate. We're talking about individuals who don't know how to read and write. Everything is by word of mouth, and in many ways also by force. So if you now think of the ruling class being completely out of sync with its moral side, being completely corrupt, having aberrant behaviors, whimsical behaviors, then it is very easy for us to see how the rest of society would follow suit. And then what you have is a hodgepodge of individuals who take justice in their own hands and who attempt to do whatever they want, and it becomes what the Roman Empire was later to be known for, a society ruled by force and the will of the rule of the strongest. So imagine growing old in a society like that. You grow old, you grow older, you grow more feeble. You do not have the same strength that you have when you are in your late teens, early 20s. So you imagine you start growing old, you become even more tyrannical, because that is a way that psychologically we find to push away our enemies, since we now no longer can fend them off with our own brutish force, physical force. You become even more tyrannical, and you see, especially in those individuals who manage to govern for slightly longer periods of time, you see this tyrannical force at play, the psychological behavior of attacking even before you are provoked, attacking with the justification that if you kill first, you are reducing the number of your enemies. This was Rome at the very, very end of the Republic, through the two triumvirates and through its empire, here specifically speaking, through its empire phase. We see, for instance, a very interesting, of course, there's always an exception or another, but we see very interestingly that if you look at the number of individuals who were in power, the length of their ruling of their government begins to decrease and gets shorter and shorter as we go into the empire stage of the Roman civilization until the very end at 473.
Continue.
Yes, please. There are no questions, we can continue.
The leaders of Rome. After Gaius was assassinated on Aventinus, although it was supposed to look like a suicide, a regime of an almost complete dissolution of the great moral victories was definitely installed. Marius came to power after victories against Jugurtha and the Germans, who in turn had invaded the territory of the Gauls. But social enmities brought Sicily to power through cruel struggles, foreshadowing the dark eve of bloody overthrows. Next came Pompey and the Catiline rebellion, during which Cicero's prudence did much to keep the city safe. Soon thereafter came the first triumvirate with the affable politics of Caius Julius Caesar, who allied himself with Pompey and Crassus for the highest duties of the government. Historical citations would lead us away from the objectives of our effort, however. Our intention is to show that the determinism of the spirit world has always been that of love, solidarity, and the good, but within the relative circle of their liberties, human beings have changed that higher determinism in the ongoing course of civilization. The Roman generals were able to conquer with iron and fire, straying from their most sacred duties and obligations, and by force of arms extended to other peoples the ties they were supposed to forge only with their culture and experience of life. But their actions resulted in the bitterest fruits of trial and suffering for humankind, and that is why nearly all of them entered the spirit realm, hotly pursued by their many victims and amid the despairing voices of the harshest accusations. After endless decades of expiatory suffering, many of them could be seen without their fine armor, crawling like worms along the banks of the Tiber, or holding out their filthy hands as loathsome beggars on Esquilinus.
Thank you. All right. So we're speaking here of the very end of the Republic, of the Republican period. And we start with generous Gaius Marius. So this is, I want to make a point. His name is Gaius Marius, because if you see on the first paragraph, it says only Gaius. Then on the second one, you have only Marius. So are we talking about two individuals? No, it's one and the same general, just to let you know. Okay, so Gaius Marius was actually a very important general. He won many battles, and he was such a good general in the sense of the battlefield, but also of what he was doing to Rome, that he was appointed consul. At the time when we have the Republic does not have presidents, it has a consul. That is the name of the highest, one of the highest positions in power, consul. So he was appointed consul of Rome 7 times. His political life spent so many years. It's actually one of the last and most prolific governors of Rome or the Roman territories, that he is actually next to Romulus and Remulus, as he's considered the 3rd founder of Rome, just to give you an idea. Nevertheless, as good as he was also assassinated brutally. And but he was the one that won, for instance, the battle against Jugurtha. This is the what we call the Jugurthine Wars, and this is with the between the Roman Republic and the Kingdom of Numidia, and eventually that, which is in northern Africa, and eventually that got annexed as well as part of Roman territory. And he, of course, had his own enemies, and one of them, the one that actually succeeded him, is Sulla, not Silla. Please correct there. It's Sulla, Sulla, for Lucius Cornelius Sulla Felix. Sulla, Sulla. He is the one that now succeeds Gaius Marius, and eventually also is assassinated. And we then have one individual after another. We have Pompey. Pompey had to deal with a person called Catilius. Catilius was actually a patrician, a nobleman. So he incited the population of Rome against the consul, Pompey, at the time. And he had to contain that. Like I said, this is an example of empires falling from within. So this is what we should take here. Not remember the names, not remember the dates, but remember that empires fall from within. And if we see ourselves as a little empire on our own, we should be careful, because the expression empires fall from within can be applied to ourselves, in the sense that we are the ones who create our own difficulties in life. If we are not careful, if we do not attempt at least to improve ourselves both morally and intellectually, but particularly morally, we see later that Emmanuel makes a point again to comment that the spiritual realm had great ideas for plans for Rome, through its physical territories, so the physical thing, but also from the individuals that were reincarnated as part of the government. However, it's one thing what we promise to do in the spiritual realm, and it's a completely different thing what we end up doing once we are here in the physical realm. As we arrive here, and this is why we learn in Spiritism or we are taught in Spiritism, that we can learn everywhere. We can learn here in the physical realm, and we can also learn in the spiritual realm. Of course, there is learning in the spiritual realm. The problem is, in the spiritual realm, we always find ourselves amidst those who share our beliefs to some degree. So it's a lot easier there for us to apply what we have just learned, but we really don't get tested. We get tested, and very well tested, when we come here to the physical realm, because then we are amidst every type of individual, those who share our views, our ideals, our perspectives of the world, and those who do not. And among those who do not, we have those who do not share but respect our own views, and those who do not share but go at us as if we are enemies just because we think differently. So the real tests eventually end up being here in the physical realm, at this level of our development. So those individuals who probably promised a lot before he reincarnated as part of the Roman upper class, when they came, they did not follow through. Their promises were just empty promises, like most. And it was that lack of love, that lack of solidarity and good, that eventually brought Rome to ruins. And just be very careful with the end of this paragraph. Historical citations will lead us away. The very end, I'm just going to read. Human beings have changed that higher determinism in the ongoing course of civilization. I don't know if the word determinism applies there, to be honest with you, because there is no such a thing. There is no determinism. So perhaps the word there, or the idea there, is simply this: the spiritual realm, the high order spirits, had educated, had trained, had assisted, as they do this, for us as well, that had assisted and educated those who were soon to be reincarnated as part of the Roman upper class. However, having been educated with the loftiest ideals does not mean that we are going to follow through. You can teach someone in the sense of you can give them the information, but they are the ones who will decide if they're going to learn or not. I always like to say there are two things about teaching. One, you cannot teach what you don't know, which is easy to think, but you cannot teach what people do not want to learn. So those high order spirits had probably many conversations. There were educational seminars, there were discussions and everything, but once we come here, and we also receive that guidance. But once we come here, we still have our guardian spirit, our guardian angel, whichever you prefer to call it, whatever you prefer to call it. We still continue to receive instructions and guidance. But the question is, do we heed them? Do we pay attention to them? Do we implement? Sometimes we heed them, we pay attention to them, we listen, but do we implement them in our daily lives? These governors, these ruling individuals, this ruling class, most certainly did not. And it was from one blunder after another that they led the empire, led Rome to ruin. So be careful with the word determinism there. Determinism here, not in the sense that there is no other way around it, but is in the sense of they put a lot of effort. They were determined. It's in this sense of being determined to teach, to educate, to ennoble these individuals as spirits before coming here as the ruling class. It is in this sense that you should see higher determinism, higher goals, higher or loftier goals. It's in this sense, not in the sense of that they determine how they should act. No, we still have free will. We are educating ourselves and educating and developing our free will. And this is very important. So what happens? Now we see the next paragraph, and man is saying, well, what they should have conquered with ideals of better education, with ideals of more understanding, they conquered by the sword. So they conquered by iron and fire. So they strayed from the sacred duties and obligations to which they had bound themselves when they were in the spiritual realm. And why is this permitted? Simply because we should be the ones building our future. The spiritual realm educates us. The spiritual realm guides us, warns us, always. The vilest individual on this planet Earth has guidance. No one is devoid of guidance. But the question is whether we pay attention and whether we implement what we hear from the high order spirits. So these individuals had sacred duties in the sense that they committed themselves when they were there before reincarnating, but they came and they did whatever they decided to do at that time. And of course, cause and consequence then comes in, and we create for ourselves the consequences that are just a natural progress of our own actions. We even say cause and consequence as if they were two things. They're not two things. It's a continuum. It's the result of our actions. It's as if our actions continued, basically. So now you see these individuals going back, the members of the ruling class of Rome, going back to the spiritual realm. And this applies to us. We don't have a ruling class. Going back to the spiritual realm by the passing or the death of their physical bodies. And the moment they step out of their physical bodies, so to speak, poetically speaking, the moment that they are disconnected from that physical body, they are already being assailed by all of those, or judged by all of those to whom they were mean, to whom they insulted, to whom they assassinated, you name it. I told you the history of this part of the Roman Empire, generally speaking, is filled with the goriest details possible, filled with assassinations. So imagine you have all your victims waiting, salivating for you to get there, waiting to ensnare you and make you go through the worst thing, the most egregious situations possible. And that's what happened. And why is it again permitted? Where is divine justice in this case? Divine justice is in cause and consequence. They had led themselves to such an enmity, to having so many enemies. And now they have to pay the price. They have to continue in that sense. So it's not surprising to see them being now persecuted by their prior victims. It's not also surprising to see them clinging on to armors or clinging on to their past lives, in the, as I say here, along the banks of the river Tiber, because they were so earthbound, so materialistic here, not necessarily in the sense of consumption, of consumerism, but materialistic in the sense that they all they worried about was what was on planet Earth, was on the physical. So they know nothing more. So they are suffering. They are now, as in the spiritual realm, they do not have a physical body anymore. And yet they find themselves attracted and bound to the earth, to that particular life, because they never educated themselves to see anything beyond that point. And this should be something for all of us to learn. We don't have to have been a general in Rome, or a president, or a prime minister, or anything. We all have this. If we do not take care of ourselves here, if we do not worry, not worry, if we not concern ourselves with improving ourselves morally, we will find spiritual realm, particularly the return up to the spiritual realm, very difficult. We will either find ourselves in the clutches of our enemies, the clutches of which will become our obsessors, if they are already not our obsessors right now, or we'll find ourselves bound here to the physical realm. We stay in the same house we grew up in, or staying in the same place where we worked, or where we had a partnership in a firm or something, simply because we never saw and educated ourselves beyond the material world, especially the physical world. So let us learn from the great names in history so we avoid repeating their mistakes.
I think when they talk about determinism there, Julio, it's more, it's really, if you read I think the word, the English version of determinism is much stronger than the Portuguese word for determinism.
Yes.
Which is more of like a blueprint or a plan. So the plan of the spiritual world for us is, of course, love, solidarity, and the well-being. But we are the ones that change it. We are the ones with our free will that go against the spiritual world ideas for our progress, right?
Yes, Ron. Actually, the word in English should be determination, not determinism.
It's right.
Yeah. When you have you have in your idea, like when Jesus said, for instance, in the sense of, if you had enough faith, or the faith of a grain of mustard, you could move that mountain. You could say to that mountain, move from here to there. That is determination, not determinism.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the word there should be determination, which is, this is why there is this possible idea of that there is you have to follow it, then they have no way around it. But it's not that, it's the effort that we put in, which is exactly what you mentioned.
And then Julio.
Yes,
Well, from my standpoint, the reason that it's not that many comments is because your explanation is so thorough and complete that it's very good and it's easy. You make it easy for us to understand this chapter. But it's interesting that Emmanuel goes back and forth in time, does not follow a chronological sequence, right?
Correct.
It goes from the orange to the end of the empire and back and forth. And my conclusion to that was this question, why does he do that? It's because he's not really trying to teach us history or human anthropology. He's showing us the tendencies that not of history repeating itself, but spirits repeating themselves, having a very hard time of get rid of those vices that leads to all the problems that the Roman Empire faced, the Ever Empire faced, and that we are facing it right now.
Yes, exactly. No, good point. It's not history that repeats itself. We should remember, spirits make history. So it's the spirits that repeat their behaviors.
Correct, yeah.
I wish we could blame history.
That's right.
Because, okay, I have to do it because history tells me to, but no, it's not like that.
And Julio, when we were making parallels with the Roman civilization, with the Persian, and you know, the practicality of the Romans, and the more pure philosophical approach of the Greeks, it is said that in terms of mass reincarnations, right? The Athenians are the reincarnated in France, the Spartans reincarnated in German, and the Romans reincarnated here. And you just have to go to Washington to see all the Roman Empire still there in the monuments and everything, right? I think it's interesting.
Yes, there are very, very good similarities. Eagles here and there. Yes, emblems. Yeah, it's quite fascinating too. People who study heraldry, you know, heraldic symbols, they can actually nowadays, I mean, without having a spiritist background, they can actually trace these symbols of military troops, for instance, or even governmental symbols. They can actually trace back, you know, their origins to other civilizations, because we end up, if we do not have a reincarnation belief, we say we end up copying from other civilizations. But since we know and we believe in reincarnation, what we should say is we end up repeating the things we did in previous lives. Yes.
Keep bringing back the symbols that we used in other lives. You know, unfortunately, we bring our worst tendencies, and you know, we fight against them all the time. But you know, still progress.
Definitely. No. The world is progressing. I mean, the difficulty we have is that we always have a tendency to look around ourselves. But like you always remind us, if we look overall, humanity is progressing. No matter what we want to say, no matter how negative, pessimistic we want to be, you just look at what was 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and just keep going backwards. And we'll see there is progress. But we should never, ever think of ourselves, because the history of our own lives is not representative of the whole. It's just one point. It's part of the whole, but not representative in the sense that I can say, oh, whatever I'm going through here today is what everybody's experiencing. That is not exactly true. Okay, Philip? The Age of Augustus.
The Age of Augustus. After the triumvirates had ended, and after the first Caesars of the Roman Empire had come to power, it was time for Christ's mission. The consoling nearness and presence of the divine master in the world was a reason for all hearts to experience new life, even though they were unaware of the divine source of those comforting vibrations. As a consequence, Augustus's government resulted in a time of great tranquility for Rome and the rest of the planet's organized societies. Enormous constructive or reconstructive endeavors were undertaken. Beautiful monuments were erected. The artistic and philanthropic spirit of Athens lived again in the person of Maecenas, the confidant of the emperor. whose benevolence dispensed the most caring attention to the learned and superior minds of the time, such as Horace and Virgil, who, along with other outstanding intellectual expressions, mark the so-called Age of Augustus with their many works.
Thank you. Beware of alms when they are too many or too abundant. Even the saints are concerned in those situations. In other words, beware of the calm before the storm. The Age of Augustus marks an attempt to correct for the first gory aspects of the end of the Republican era. And in principle, of course, when you were living there during that time, the idea that, okay, everything is fine, we are going the right direction. And actually it derailed very quickly, very, very quickly. As the Republic loses its ability to coordinate the governmental machinery, three individuals, Julius Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey, put together the first triumvirate. Divaldo Franco has a beautiful lecture that he gave in Portugal. So it's in YouTube. I don't know if it's translated, I'm sorry, but it's worth checking if it's translated. But where he describes a little bit about this period of the two triumvirates. Pompey, Julius Caesar, and Crassus put together the first one. That's around 60 before the Common Era. And you have the second triumvirate that starts at 43 before the Common Era with Mark Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian. Octavian will later become the first Augustus. So when Emmanuel speaks of Augustus here in this part that we just read, now we're already speaking of Octavian as the emperor. And with Octavian, we see, and all of this is just before the advent of Jesus, the advent of Christ as the human being, Jesus. So we see at this point an immense amount of construction in Rome, an embellishment of the old city, of the capital of that massive governor of so many territories. And we ended up seeing also the figure of Maecenas, who was so important for the arts as a confidant of Octavian, of the emperor, of first Augustus, that today we use his name as a name for individuals, for instance, who are patrons of the arts. We can say, oh, that person is a good Maecenas. It's in the sense that he gives money, or he gives venues for the arts. He promotes art. So it became actually a synonym. Be careful, we're not talking about mercenaries, okay? Or mercenary, Maecenas, which is very different. And what we see in this this time is perhaps the last attempt Rome had of beautiful constructions and of some form of egalitarianism across its two classes, basically the patricians and the plebeians. After this, what we will see is a slow derrocate, is a slow decline towards complete ruin. But there was this huge burst of productivity and utilitarianism, according to the standards of the time, of course. If we were to go back with a time machine and look at what they were doing, we would say, this is what you call humanitarianism? Well, it was for the concept of the time, for the ideas of the time. Okay, so we have to be very careful, always analyze history within a context. So what can we learn from the Age of Augustus? Well, perhaps we should learn that whenever things are going well for us, everything is so-called peachy or a bed of roses, we should be careful and even more watchful so that we do not get so comfortable with that idea that we end up creating our own demise. It is very, very common in history when you look at it. Every time there was a period of great strides and great accomplishments, that it's very common to have that period immediately followed by a period of moral decadence or a period of just downright decadence, whether it's physical or moral, because those individuals that build into that period, they are the ones who had to strive. They are the ones who had to put a lot of effort. So they conquered that period of benevolences or accomplishments with the sweat of their brows. But then those who are born within that period, whether it's the sons, the children or the grandchildren, and so on and so forth. So it's children, grandchildren. What we see is that they have not imparted any effort of their own to create all that. They got everything ready for them. And it is usually the case that they give less appreciation, less appreciation for all that has been accomplished. And with that, they begin taking things for granted. We all do that. Remember that history is nothing more than our past actions. We are here because we believe, among many things, in reincarnation. We were one of those individuals in some point of our history or another. So we should always be very careful. Perhaps what we can learn from this Age of Augustus block is this: when things are going okay for us, let us make sure that, first of all, if we built into this period of abundance, that we do not get so cocky, so excessively confident that we begin to overlook basic things. And let us make sure that those under our education umbrella, our children or our nephews, nieces, or students, whatever it is, that they understand all the effort to create that. Because if we do not, but usually what happens is that we do this in the worst possible way. We always say, oh, I had to work much more than you had, the generation issue. This is not what I'm talking about. I am talking about educating these individuals to see how efforts can bring better accomplishments so that they can have accomplishments of their own, not to throw in their faces what our generation or the previous generation have done. This creates a form of a friction of called it's a form of friction, let's put it this way, between the generations. And one ends up doing exactly the opposite, just out of spite. It's very human nature to do so. So we have to be careful with periods of abundance. Let us educate all of those who are born inside of that period, within that period, especially if the period is very long, and let us educate them to learn to appreciate the effort that was put to get to that level, so that they too can be more confident, but also more vigilant, and maintain that as long as possible. The human history is filled with a cyclic wave of ups and downs, because the moment that we get an up, eventually, a next generation comes in, or a second or a third, and it starts to degrade whatever was accomplished, because we do not teach the following generations to be appreciative. So let us take this Age of Augustus and learn from it as something like this, not to be afraid of moments or periods of abundance, but to actually take that opportunity and educate the coming generations to be appreciative. Not through what we call psychology of guilt. Oh, your father had to work so hard. Oh, your grandfather or your grandmother had to do this. No, not that. Because that will instill in them some form of hatred for it. No, but let us show them, the new generations, everything that they themselves can do to make it even better than what they already have. This is how we are going to maintain these moments of abundance, these moments of great achievements in our history. And this was, of course, not what was done at the time of Augustus. They knew less than we know today. So we'll see very, very clearly that once Octavian passes away, we begin to see a slow decline, which speeds up tremendously, especially after Jesus is crucified.
And it's interesting, right? Because the age of Augustus is really the preparation of the coming of Jesus, right? The incarnation of Jesus. So the world is finding itself in peace, in harmony, in progress. So preparing for the coming of Jesus, and of course, then we did what we did, but that's for the continuation of the study.
Yep. The age of Augustus is what is called today New Age, the age of Aquarius, and actually it does have some astrological similarities. We have to be very careful with these similarities, because when we analyze history after the fact, we actually end up bending the numbers to fit our own purposes. But it's the idea of the age of Aquarius, an age of progress, yes, of development, of peace, yes. In that sense, we can say for sure. But we'll see that it ends up with a betrayal, a massive betrayal. And just to let you know, one important thing, Octavian Augustus is one of the last individuals to govern Rome that died naturally. It may sound strange to say it, but you will see that after him, it's one after another who ends up being assassinated while in power, and usually by their successors. But what would become their successors? So it's brutal. It's brutal. So Philip, we can go and read the transition of an era.
The transition of an era. After Augustus, history witnessed the deceitful and cruel personality of Tiberius, his adopted son, ending the era of peace, labor, and harmony with the return of the Lamb to the sublimated realms of the light. It was during his reign that Judea brought about the tragedy of Golgotha, thereby sinisterly fulfilling the age-old prophecies. In spite of his compassionate and unveiled love, the divine master was put to death on the cross by the imposition of Judaism, which did not comprehend his love and humility. Rome collaborated in the dolorous event with the cold indifference of Pontius Pilate, returning to its feasts and pleasures as if completely unaware of the noblest purposes of life. Following the same contemptible road as Tiberius, Caligula inaugurated a long period of darkness, massacres and fires, devastation and bloodshed.
Okay, now we get to the gory part.
Okay.
Octavian, or Augustus, had an adopted son, Tiberius. And fortunately, Tiberius did not assassinate his foster parent, his foster father, but was the one who succeeded him in governing the Roman provinces and the Roman Empire. Now we can say empire because now we're speaking of the empire literally. And he was not as enlightened as his father. And he was assassinated. It's not clear if he was assassinated by Caligula or one of his own Praetorian guards. And the Praetorian guards were the ones that were supposed to keep the emperor safe, just to give you an idea of the irony of the situation. Actually, a lot of them were assassinated by Praetorian guards, who eventually took the opportunity to rise to power. So Tiberius is followed by Caligula, Caligula by Claudius, and they are all assassinated by conspiracies, either directly by the successor, or by conspiracies between the successor to the throne and the Praetorian guards. So we see a horrible. It's very difficult to think of how to govern an empire under such conditions, and we see that the number of years in power begin to decrease quite considerably when you compare these individuals. Remember, these days you die in office, so it's not that you retire and there's a successor. So you either die in office, as I said before, or you are assassinated, or you're pushed out of it. And well, the basic means of getting rid of someone was through assassination, not through just replacement. It is through the governing of Tiberius, not his father. Octavian died in 14 of the Common Era. 14. So Jesus was already alive, was already among us. Sorry. So Christ was already among us as a man, as Jesus Christ. But it is through it's during the reign of Tiberius that Jesus is brought to the Golgotha, the skull mountain, the Golgotha or skull mountain, and crucified. When they say here that he was crucified by the imposition of Judaism, we have to understand what it means here, because we have to be very careful with these things so that we don't start creating a separatism. We all believe in the same God. We all believe, the Christian beliefs are, in many cases, also Judaic beliefs. But according to the prophecies of the time, and remember, we have to speak of Judaism now because there is no Christianism. Christ has not started, or he's beginning to preach. So we have only Judaism when we think about a monotheistic religious belief. The belief from the prophets, not because the prophets said so, but because it was interpreted as such, right? We can say whatever we want. We may have the loftiest goals in our heads, and someone might misunderstand us, misinterpret us, or even maliciously change what we want to convey. So the belief was that the king would be one that would come and remove them from the oppression. We had at this point, for instance, just at the very end of the Republic, we had Judea conquered by the Romans. So now at this moment, about 100 years later, or actually about 75 years later, we have Judea still under Roman oppression or under Roman control. So the idea was that the king would be one that would be like the old king, the kings of the First Testament or Old Testament, if you prefer, the sense of like a warrior king, a king that would lead them to free their territory and lead them to an era of plenitude, an era of accomplishment, and so forth. It was not expected among the populace, among the people, that the king would be one that would be bringing them ideals of love, of universal love. So they saw in Christ perhaps too much rhetoric, but not any action. And what they wanted was action. They wanted Christ to fit their bill as opposed to changing themselves to emulate Christ. And these led us to the awful situation where they crucified, or they allowed, because they did not crucify him themselves, but they allowed him to be crucified, and Christ was one of their own. Christ had been born and raised as a Jewish individual with Jewish beliefs. So it was idea of Christ, of Jesus' teachings and preachings not fitting their bill that led him to be reneged basically by his own people. And then we have the situation of Pontius Pilate, who was the governor of Judea at the time, was the one responsible and the one who had to answer for it to Rome. He literally said, "I wash my hands." In this lecture I mentioned to you from Divaldo Franco that was given in Lisbon, it's a very long lecture, it's about 3 hours, 3.5 hours, or 3 hours and 20 minutes. Divaldo mentions that, I forgot her name now, but Pontius's wife comes to him and says to him, "Be careful with this man," because he was about to judge if Christ should be crucified, should be taken to the Golgotha or not. And his wife comes to him and said, "Be careful with this man. He has been tormenting me the entire night." So she actually had been in spirit, during her dreams, during her sleep, she had actually seen and talked to Jesus, and she had realized the seriousness of that historic moment without being able to put into detail. So she comes to her husband and says, "Be careful with this man. He is much more than he represents himself to be." And still, he washes his hands. The famous expression. He washes his hands. He said, "Well, if the people wanted this, I will not go against the people. I do not want a rebellion, in my hands. I do not want to have to impose the Praetorian Guard, the guards on them. So I would just do what the people told me to do, and I don't care about it." And he goes back to the banquet. There was a banquet being happening in the background, and he goes back to the banquet after having washed his hands with respect to Jesus's life. And Jesus is then brought first to the. At this point, Jesus had already been humiliated by the guards, had been already beaten by the guards, had been spat on by one of the guards. And Divaldo speaks of this particular incident of the guards spitting on Jesus' face, and what Jesus said and what the guard felt at the end. And it's from this point on that we have the usual symbolism of the crown of thorns being put in his head, and he's carrying the cross through the city all the way to the mountain, because they were crucifying and leaving those individuals there for a while until they would be completely dead. And then that's when some of them would receive permission from the governor, from Pilate, to retrieve the bodies. Not all of them had their bodies retrieved. Most of the times, the bodies were left on the cross after being dead to rot, to feed the birds. But in case there was intercession, and in the case of Jesus, they received permission by the head of the guards to have the body retrieved and buried, according to which was not buried particularly, but placed in a small cave, in a sepulcher, which is not really buried in the sense of putting under 6 feet of dirt, of ground. So we see here that all that preparation of the age of Augustus and then the coming of Jesus Christ ends up being not taken advantage of in its entirety. It's in some ways being wasted, because perhaps we could have we could be today in a much better position. We could have been in a much better position had we heeded and had history developed differently. But we were there as one of our previous reincarnations, perhaps as Tiberius, perhaps as the Pontius Pilate, washing our hands, or perhaps as one of the many in the crowd that cried, "Thief, and let's get rid of him," or one of those who cried. One way or another, what we should take from this is that since we do believe in reincarnation, perhaps we should be very, but very careful about the trials that are being subjected to us today. Are we being Pontius Pilate in many occasions in our lives? Are we just washing our hands and going with the flow simply because, as we say, I don't have enough time for it? That's a modern expression, right? We've all heard this. Oh, I don't have time for this. And we end up taking the easy road. But the easy road is nothing more than a modern euphemism for washing one's hands off the problem. Or perhaps we were the tyrant at the throne, Tiberius, or one of those in the crowd crying, "Murder him, he's a thief," or "Murder him, we don't care, we don't want to espouse his beliefs because he is not the real king or the king that we want him to be." How many times we want others to fit our bill, our ideals, our way of thinking. So when we see these things in history, the idea is not to judge, but to look inside of ourselves and see if we can learn something so that we will not repeat this mistake ourselves.
Okay.
Okay.
Julio, I think we should leave the last two items for next month because they are really important.
Oh yeah.
There is a
No,
lot
I
of
wasn't
discussion
planning.
there.
That's why
Yeah.
we still have some time for questions.
Yeah, I was just taking a quick look, and I think there's so much to discuss in the next couple of items, right?
Mm-hmm. We don't have doesn't have to be one chapter per day. So we go with the flow.
And so everything's so familiar, huh? Oh my God.
Yeah. If we go deep in our unconscious, we are going to find ourselves in those times.
Exactly.
One way or another, as Julio mentioned. I think it's,
yes.
We just have to look our tendencies today, right?
One day you'll get there.
Yes, we have eternity ahead of us, right, Renato? Okay.
Just listen to everything. The only thing that I could was questioning myself. It's because nowadays we have some good spirits that come to help to influence and give us good examples. We had Jesus himself at that time. We have the Buddhas, the Mother Teresas, and everyone. I was thinking, where were those spirits at that time? At least from what we read there, to help to, I don't know, not saying change, but
They were there. We just didn't listen to them.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's hard to listen to all this because it's we don't have to punish ourselves on that, but we just have to. While I was in, so just with my head down and reflecting. Okay, let's just take it and try to do better. And as you said, we have the turn to catch up what we've done. It's complicated.
It's important to think we have time to catch up, but we should also not use it as an excuse not to do anything now, right? And let us remember that Emmanuel, the author of this book, right, the one that dictated the book to Francisco Xavier, Cândido Xavier, Emmanuel was there at the time of Christ, right, as Publius Lentulus, and he did not believe in Christ. His wife Livia did, but he did not. He was not necessarily one persecuting the early Christians, let's put it this way, but he definitely did not espouse Christ's ideas. But then we see in the books 2,000 years ago, right? And what is
50 years later.
Yeah, and 50 years later, we see how quickly he changed, because he decided. If you read those two books, which are amazing, they're quite beautiful, you see how much he was struggling as an intelligent individual. He said, well, let me try the other remedy, because if the one I'm taking is not working, and I'm still sick, I'm still suffering, let me try the other one. And he does, and he is now the one writing to us these beautiful, some of these the most beautiful books we have in the Spiritist doctrine. So we also have to, because there is a form of, it's important to know that we have time, that we can develop, that we don't have to rush. This is it, that we don't have to rush, but we should also not use that as an excuse, which is not what Ron wanted to say initially when he said we have eternity. What he meant there is that we should not rush into things. We should do it and do it and consolidate that knowledge. But there are some of us who are always thinking of, oh, if I have enough time, I'll do this next time. I'll do this. It's always procrastinating. And we should not do that. Use the supposed to be eternal time ahead of us as an excuse for not applying ourselves from now, because we're just prolonging our suffering right now. Being imperfect is in itself a form of suffering. We may actually not be aware of it, simply because we are very comfortable with certain things from the physical realm that take our attention from the problem. But whenever we go back to the spiritual realm and those issues or those things from the physical realm are no longer present, we realize, whoops, I had a reincarnation process that was very poorly used. And we should avoid that as much as possible. Not rush, because as Ron said, we have a long time ahead of us, but also not use that as an excuse for procrastination.
Yeah, we just, I didn't want to touch that, but since you mentioned, we always say that we were there. And Emmanuel was there. Look at the manual today. And then you have, you have the Vivaldi, the Chichos, and everyone that were also there. And then you look at ourselves. Of course, we can't compare. We made, our choices, and we are where we are. And as you always explain, guilt's not gonna help on anything. But it makes you wonder, right? If we were all there, and you look all this spirit there helping us and working hard and to give all this purification so we can catch up. Of course, you're right. I understand that we have time, but we're late. I mean, that's just on me. I'm avoiding to beat myself too much, but I can't help to think on the choice that we made and the position that we are today. But we're trying to do something, and eventually I'll get there.
Yeah. Just a quick comment before we close. We should stop using the expression to catch up, because to catch up means that we are defining ourselves by an external factor or by someone else. We have to evolve, period. That's all. So if my pace now is to evolve to point X, when someone is already evolving to point Y or Z, that's okay. Mine is to evolve to X. So when we say catch up, It means that someone or something else has defined a point for us to reach. And we should not do that, because that is when we begin to procrastinate out of disappointment, because we see that we have a definition of a set point or an end point, in this particular case, an end point. And the end point may be, in our view, too far away. So we can say, oh, I will never get there, so why bother? No, let us say to ourselves always, I would like to be tomorrow a little bit better than I am today. 10 years from now, a little bit better than I am today, and so on and so forth. But always to oneself, the set point and the end point, always beginning and ending respectively within ourselves, not catch up, because catch up, as I said, necessarily implies someone or something else has determined the end point for us. Okay, this is for all of us. This is
Thank you.
not for Renato's comment, is for all of us. It's very important. So we have a healthy attempt and a healthy improvement of ourselves. We'll stop here now. I think João probably has some announcements.
Yeah, so next Sunday is the last Sunday of the month. So normally we have a lecture. And what we will have next Sunday is the continuation of our studies of fundamentals of mediumship. And we'll have the second part of the study of the perispirit. And Jussara is going to present the role of perispirit in mediumship. So for those that watched my presentation on the perispirit, the introduction of the perispirit last Sunday of May, we mentioned that we were going to continue with the perispirit and the perispirit in the role of mediumship. So that's going to be next Sunday with Jussara. Okay, so she's going to be presenting a guest appearance of Jussara here on our Sunday study groups. So Sunday at 11 a.m. next Sunday. Okay, you're all invited. Besides that, we mentioned the studies of Emmanuel. Yesterday we had a very interesting lecture by Altino Majesti from London on the romances of Emmanuel, the 5 romances of Emmanuel, and the discussion of the importance and a little bit. So if you want to catch up, you can watch it on our YouTube page, SGNY, Spiritist Group of New York YouTube page. There's a lot of videos. Our classes are there. Please subscribe. We need to increase the number of subscribers so we can improve the page. And you can find all the information there. Okay, so that's it for us. Happy Father's Day for all fathers here in the US. And we are going to ask Carol to do our final prayer. Carol.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Julio. Thank you, everyone. Infinite Creator, Supreme Intelligence, the good spirits who are with us, assisting us to become more unified in our studies and to receive the benefits of what we have learned today through the studies of On the Way to the Light. We are truly grateful. We give thanks to our spiritual benefactors, the good spirits, the mentors, the healers who are with us, guiding us, assisting us, helping us, and giving us more courage to forge ahead on the path each day. May we continue with our prayers, with our studies, with our mindfulness and contemplations throughout the week. And may we engender the faith, the trust, and the courage to do so. We are grateful for the opportunity that we have had today, and may we receive the blessings and the understanding of what we have learned, the studies of the Roman Empire and the studies of Rome, so that we can learn more effectively, more efficiently, the lessons of history. May we be mindful that these can be actually playing out in today's world. We can take stock of it, but we want to maintain a high vibration and maintain a courageous outlook, an optimistic outlook in this lifetime. As we close now, we humbly ask for the love and light of Christ to go with us, to go with not only ourselves, but with our family, our friends, our loved ones, and co-workers. We have received many blessings, and we will continue to receive many more as we do our part. And as we close now, we ask for safety, protection, and guidance for all of us. And we close as beacons of light, going forth each day, doing better and better in our world. So be it.